Good morning again to another entry of Snow Cone Diaries. As you can see, it's light out today. My youngest is in school. Mom is off. It's a little rainy today, but generally another beautiful day in Florida. I wanted to continue some of the discussions that we had last session around history, ancient history in particular. It's important to understand your history, your own personal history, or our sociological and speciological history, so that we are not doomed to repeat mistakes. That's why you study history, right? If you cannot evolve and you cannot learn, you will regress and die, stagnate, right? This is just a law of the universe, right? Evolve or die, right? This is Darwinism. It's a law of the universe that he discovered, right? There is a historical narrative, let's call it. There's a set of teachings and a sort of linear progression that is taught that really needs to be pulled apart a little bit, and I'm going to try and do that. So and I covered some of this before, but I'm going to go a little bit deeper today. I'm not sure how long this is going to last. I have notes in front of me, and then I have the ability to look at some audio visuals, which I'm going to get better at as I go on. So the narrative, of course, is that we evolved from, some more primitive human hominid species a couple of 100,000 years ago, learned how to think, and then evolved and came out of Africa through sort of a single threading of the human population, so to speak, around 65, 70,000 years ago. And then that single genetic pool effectively populated the earth. And that, that narrative is typically backed up by archaeological evidence, the bones, the genealogical genetic evidence, study of the human genome, and then archaeological settlements as they potentially progress and have been identified. And it's sort of a nice, clean story. Of course, what they're finding as they study the human genome is that there's lots of different mating and crossing over of whether it's Neanderthals, Homo erectus, or a lot of other things. And they're finding that, of course, that that's a little bit confusing. And these populations, when they seeded a place, they may have been, they may have superseded an existing population that was there already. They may probably mated with them and then took over. That's, that's not the American way, although it is kind of the American way, but it's the, the way of man as a sort of, violent sort of empire building type of species. I mean, that's really what Homo sapiens is, right? I mean, if we peel it back, and a lot of that, is buried in the intellectual movement today about toxic masculinity and all that other stuff, which is part of what we're really beginning to explore. Okay, so that narrative has civilization in terms of agriculture, domestication, okay, and a variety of other technological advancements occurring somewhere between 7,000 or 8,000, BCE. It varies in the Fertile Crescent area, and there's a parallel development that occurs in the Far East in China, and then certainly one that happens in Northern Africa and Egypt. And that's, again, the area that I focus on. I call that Eurasian history. And I focus on that because primarily the world's civilizations as we stand today rest upon those sociological infrastructure that was in Eurasia in antiquity. Northern Africa, the Mediterranean, Greece and Rome, okay, the Near East, Persia, Iran, Iraq, the Indian subcontinent, right, the Vedas, Hinduism, and then the Far East, China, okay? There are all sorts of variations of that. That's primarily what I focus on. The Native American cultures, unfortunately, were all but decimated by the Europeans when they came. There's pockets of that still survive, but honestly, it's a type of mass destruction that the world has seen far too many times. Far too many times. So, but clearly there was an advanced civilization that was here when they got here, and clearly by the time they were here for about 100 years, it was gone. So you put those pieces together. That's the linear progression. Okay, so a couple of outlier pieces of data. We're going to talk about that quite a bit from a scientific perspective. Okay, there's a couple outlier pieces of data that just don't fit that narrative. Okay, And by the way, I'm just as much of a skeptic as anybody else when it approaches to mysticism, whether it's approached to historical narratives or all this other stuff. Okay, I want to see evidence. I want to see knowledge that stands the test of reason. Okay, and no truth should go against reason. Okay, you don't just believe on blind faith, all these things. Okay, but you have a narrative. This is the way science is structured, right? You have a theoretical framework that's established, and then you do testing and you get knowledge and you get data and you see if it lines up with that theoretical framework. If it does not, you expand the theoretical framework. You do not abandon the data. Having said that, there's a basic psychological principle at work, and it's called cognitive dissonance, which means that if shit doesn't fit into your way of believing and your way of seeing, you're going to ignore it because it's unsettling. That's just the way that we are, the way we work, the way that we behave. By the way, you see the same thing at the individual psychological level when you look at PTSD and trauma and all this. People block shit out all the time. And, you know, maybe a piece of data, something that reminds them of something, they just block it out. Put your blinders on and move forward. And you start with that psychological principle, okay, that we do have not just the capability, but are predisposed to ignore things that don't fit our narrative. We are slow to change and to shift, which is not necessarily a bad thing, by the way. Conservative in our views. Precession talks about this in terms of dynamic and static quality. You build a static quality infrastructure, okay, that is built based upon reason, and then you have sort of a dynamic, direct influx of information that feeds into the system that ultimately evolves it and pushes it. This is the whole idea of conservative and liberal frameworks, and this whole dynamic of the two poles and the yin and the yang, and from the two there's the three. And this is the nature of the world that we live in. This is how it behaves. Our minds behave like this, okay? But the world behaves like this. The human sociological complex, civilization, society, it all behaves like this. This is how these themes and everything is worked out. Same sort of models in play that are buried in the I Ching, in fact, and are manifest in the hexagrams and the divination process itself. So a couple outlier pieces of data. First of all, you have some archeological structures that predate this linear progression through time. The pyramids are a good example. And you also have some structures that sit in South America that also seem to be dated before our timelines indicate that it should be there. Now, furthermore, the architecture that's constructed seems to defy our abilities in terms of how we understand to manipulate the physical world. It seems to defy our capabilities of understanding how these things were constructed. These were massive stones that were brought massive distances, okay, that were aligned and set up in a level of precision that is beyond our ability to understand how these people, these primitives built it. It's a major data point. Okay, you also have Göbekli Tepe, which is around 10,000 BCE or so, which seems to be sort of a very advanced, what's the name of that monument in Scotland? It's a very advanced version of that that's set up with, you know, for some sort of sacred and astrological reasons. Now, most of these major, whether it's temples or pyramids, they are all typically aligned with various formations in the stars, okay? So this tells us a couple things. This tells us that in deep antiquity, there was not only an understanding, but a respect from and an understanding of the relationship between us and our place, not just in the solar system, but in the cosmos. And these major structures are aligned, whether it's the Orion's belt to the pyramids or some of the other structures, whether it's the winter equinox or so on, solar or the summer equinox, they are lined up in such a way that they reflect and are able to really communicate and resonate with the stars in some strange way. And this is one of the reasons why we think that the pyramids are older than 3000 BCE, Old Kingdom Egypt. Graham Hancock, by the way, is a great source for some of this stuff. And I was a big skeptic of Graham Hancock for many years. I've now read a couple of his books. With respect to the revisiting of the historical narrative, he's probably the best place to start. There's a lot of data that just doesn't line up with that story. There's stuff that predates advanced civilization. How did it get there? Okay, not only that, you have buried in the written records, which start to emerge around 3000 BCE in the Fertile Crescent area, and also in ancient Egypt, but then also the Indian subcontinent, and again, far China. You have this sort of narrative, this mythological narrative about the Great Flood and the full reset of human civilization populations. You've also got narratives of divine beings coming down and distributing knowledge of how to farm and how to take care of your crops and how to build some semblance of the civilization. There seems to be a quite consistent story that is told in myths across the world of an ancient civilization that was destroyed, and then a new civilization emerged, and some of that knowledge was passed down by some of the beings that survived. That's not just, it's the hero with 1,000 faces, but it's not the hero. It's a different part of that narrative. There's the hero narrative, yes, the people a year ago into the underworld and coming back with this knowledge and sharing it with everybody, but there's a different, not only a cosmogonic narrative, a cosmological narrative about how the universe was created, which I get into in quite detail in Theology Reconsidered, but there's also a narrative of the flood and of an old civilization that was destroyed, and then a new civilization that emerges, and some of the knowledge is seeded. Whether it's Isis and Osiris, whether it's Zeus and how they fight the Titans and the gods of old, whether it's Fuzi in ancient China, whether it's Quetzalcoatl in South America, you've got a really consistent set of ideas that are being passed down in all of these written and oral traditions, okay? And this is where we get into data points that are ignored. The idea that this actually was a historical event is something that is really difficult for historians to appreciate. And I get it. It's cognitive dissonance on a grand scale. But the simplest answer is that it freaking happened. It's mind-blowing in its simplicity. And it's completely ignored in the academic community. I was trained in the Egyptology department at Brown University, the only Egyptology department in the Western Hemisphere, with a preeminent Egyptology professor, where I wrote my thesis on Hermeticism. I think I've talked about that a little bit before, which is a synthetic doctrine that developed in Greco-Egyptian Ptolemaic Egypt, which is part of that ancient wisdom from Thoth that's handed down. Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes thrice great. This was in the late 80s, no, excuse me, early 90s that I wrote this. It's not a bad paper, but anyway. That's not what they're teaching. That's for Bible scholars. For Bible scholars. What's the source of prehistory? That's what we have, these tales. And so we write them off as this primitive beings that didn't understand the universe and therefore made up these stories and just, put gods on top of them. This god did this guy did this, there's Saturn, there's Jupiter, stars. Okay. But again, you got a lot of data points that you need to consider. Okay, I'm gonna move it. So you got an archeological piece that doesn't fit. You have a written record piece that doesn't fit. Okay, what else doesn't fit? This to me is the most compelling. So I'm gonna go into this thing called the Precession of the Equinox. Okay. So bear with me for a second while I pull this up. I need to maximize this or make this bigger. So here we go. So the precession movement of the Earth. There is a precession. Okay, there's obviously the sun and the year. Okay, through the 12 signs of the zodiac and the different months and how the calendar is structured, yada, 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 obviously. Our whole lives, the sun and the moon, the week, the 7-day week, okay? The whole thing is constructed based upon our movement as it relates to the sky. Okay, and people need to really appreciate this, because I've had discussions with people on astrology. And by the way, I was, again, a massive astrology skeptic. The entire structure of your reality is based upon cosmic entities. Okay, and if you have trouble with that, okay, then you need to stop and you need to go do some research. Okay, you wake up when the sun rises. You go to sleep when the sun sets. You sleep and the moon has risen. The cycles of the moon affect the tides. Okay? The summer and the winter equinoxes, the points where I don't think I fully appreciate exactly what that is, but those 2 times of the year were always very special times of the year. But here's the kicker. We know that the Babylonians, we know that in antiquity, that either the Mayans, that all of these ancient cultures had really extremely advanced knowledge of the sky and the rotation through the sky in cycles that went well beyond the annual cycle. In the Vedas, in the Hindu tradition, they call them the yugas, okay, the ages. And effectively what you have is a description of the precession of the earth, okay, as a top. Basically, when you think about a spinning top, that top rotates every 26,000 years through the different signs of the zodiac. Okay, this is where the age of Aquarius comes in, or the age of Pisces. Okay, and a complete rotation is about 26,000 years. Okay. Here's a look at the top. You can see that. This is the idea. That's the way that the earth moves to the sky. This rotation every 26,000 years, okay? There is very clear indication that the ancients knew about this. Okay, so 26,000 years ago, these guys were just leaving caves and foraging for grapes. But at the same time, they understood what the precession of the equinoxes was. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. How could they have this advanced knowledge of the sky unless they were able to look through vast spans of time? Well beyond just 26,000, because you know as well as anybody else that in order to identify these patterns, you need to see 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. And then you're like, there's a pattern emerging. What's 5 times 26,000? That's like 150,000 years. That's before, according to most historians, the language was developed. We were still running around, using rocks to try and forage for ants or something. It doesn't line up. And this stuff is well understood, embedded in the architecture in many of the ancient texts. Okay, it's clear that the ancients astronomers knew about this. The ancient astronomers that sat at the very beginnings of civilization in Eurasia, they all knew about this. Where did they get this information from? They claim that someone came down and taught them. Like, this is the piece that we're ignoring. Every single one of them said that someone came down and told them this stuff. And that there was a great flood and all the knowledge was destroyed, and they came back and seeded a little bit. This was the whole, the gods and this whole sort of pantheon and that whole idea, which is ubiquitous almost in Eurasian antiquity. The Far East doesn't really have a lot of that, but certainly, Greece and northern Africa, Mediterranean, and the Near East, and certainly India, sort of the Indo-Aryan, if you will, heritage, which is what I call it a lot. It's sort of, it lines up and aligns with the Indo-European philological landscape. in terms of people speaking, that in Indo-European type languages. There seems to be an undercurrent of that sort of pantheon and the sort of progression of the divinity. This seems to be quite parallel. Egypt has its own nuances, but generally speaking, it's the same idea. So you also have geological evidence about the Younger and the Older Dryas and a massive ice age and a potential flooding that occurred around 10,000, 11,000 years ago. Graham Hancock talks about this too. And you have this myth of Atlantis, which is kind of where I'm going with this. And the myth of Atlantis is the other half of the story, which is, yes, everything was destroyed with a flood, and then there was a reseeding of some information or knowledge, but that reseeding of knowledge came from and out of an ancient civilization that had very technologically advanced culture and that existed on a continent that went under the sea. That's the story. Plato talks about it in Critias and also the Timaeus, okay? And he speaks of it specifically through the guise of Solon, the great ancient Greece ruler and giver of laws, okay, that ruled in the 6th century BCE, that claim through information out of Egypt and otherwise that in fact these things are true. And there was a record of it in ancient Egypt. There's also in the last 100, 150 years in this whole kind of interdimensional and channeling community, this whole idea of Atlantis has come up again and continues to come up. So as you kind of relax the notion of time and space, which from a metaphysics standpoint we're doing, right? And you relax the idea of a linear progression through time, and you move more of sort of a pattern and a cyclical spiral pattern of time and evolution of spirit and learning and soul, right? It's a Fibonacci sequence, right? Golden pi ratio, right? It's a different way of looking at time. This is the yugas, right? And the progression through time, through cycles. And you look at the historical record and the the astrological information, the archeological evidence. It starts to paint a picture that there was an ancient society that was destroyed, that had tech that we haven't found out yet, that we can't really even fully appreciate yet. And we're reaching the point of that same part of the cycle again. That seems to be the narrative that meets a theoretical framework that meets all of the criteria of the data from the different disciplines. Okay. And Dolores Cannon's work actually fills in a lot of gaps here, particularly her conversations with Nostradamus and some of the things that he sees and how he views time. So metaphysics, okay, the relaxing of your understanding, or the expansion of your understanding of time and space and physical reality, right, opens the door to multiple dimensions, different dimensions, which is talked about in yoga and the Vedas and all that other stuff in Eastern philosophy, right? Mysticism in general, right? And then you have this sort of esoteric tradition in the West of all these hidden teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, all that stuff. What you end up with is a picture of a society that had fairly advanced psychic abilities that was destroyed, probably under their own weight or with some help from the outside, because of the way that they abused some of these powers. And the trauma related to that destruction and all the death and destruction was this massive wipeout of civilization. The trauma related to that has basically shut down and deactivated all of those capabilities within us. The same capabilities that we're starting to see are starting to be activated again. The psychic abilities, the ability to see through time and space and understand dimensions, how they really are, and get a true appreciation of not only this vehicle and its capabilities, but its relationship to the physical world and the physical reality, right? And that's how some of that piece is. The historical narrative supports the metaphysical position and vice versa. They come together as part of a new intellectual edifice, which is part of what I'm trying to construct. You've got theology reconsidered, which is part of that ancient historical narrative, mythos, theos, and persona, the psyche, okay? And then you have a metaphysical structure, metaphysics of awareness, that provides the intellectual framework from which all of this can be understood, the interdimensionality piece and all of the other pieces. Okay. I'm just going to check on my notes here and see what I haven't hit. I'm not going to talk about pole shifts. Talked about. Okay, so let's talk about the psychological component just a little bit in terms of how that fits in. So you've got basically two schools. You got Freudian behavioralist psyche, and then you've got Jungian sort of collective consciousness, sort of archetypical psyche, okay? And they both ultimately are drivers and motivating forces. They're models for the drivers and motivating forces of us as individuals. Freud is more of a mechanical behavioralistic perspective, and Jung is more of an archetypical kind of mystical perspective, even though he wouldn't like that word used necessarily. The two of them are actually equally true depending upon which perspective you want to look at. The Freud is based on the id, the superego, and the ego, which is this sort of balancing structure that allows you to sort of move through the world sociologically and maintain sort of your relationship to sex and parents and friends and romance and all that other stuff. It's a primarily sort of motive, desire-driven motive system. Okay, that's part of it. But at a higher level, you've got a collective component, which Jung talks about in detail. Okay, it's called the collective unconscious, and you have archetypes, and you have this kind of idea of synchronicity through which the ethereal world, let's say the unconscious, speaks to the conscious, through which there is a sort of a line and a channel of communication that exists through the individual. Okay, so you have both of these frameworks. The collective unconscious is what we tie into myths and the narrative of symbols and as we move through time. Okay, and that's a lot of the work that Jung and some of his students did, connect a lot of those dots. Okay, when you establish the credence, okay, of the collective unconscious as a psychic thing that exists, that humanity shares, societies share, and humanity share. And this goes into the harmony of the spheres a little bit. You have an individual psyche, you have a family, social, work, community type of psyche, and then you have a nation state type of a psyche, and then you have a humanity type of a psyche, then you have an earth type of a psyche, and then you have a solar system type of a psyche, and then you have a galaxy type. All of these layers of dimensional reality, one is not less real than the other. This physical world isn't less real than the one at the galaxy or in the cosmos. They all are interwoven together and they're all interconnected. That is why what we are going through right now is so important and relevant to not just us as a species, but to the intergalactic community, more or less. I haven't talked about UFOs yet, but that's, you have interdimensionality and you have the ETs. They both exist and they're both here and helping and manipulating things. Okay. Once you recognize the reality of each one of those layers of consciousness, okay, and you're not dismissing or in any way this reality, this physical reality, once you understand its connection, you can then not only tap into those other dimensions, but you have a better sense of, from a long-term perspective, where we are and where we're headed and where we've been, which is what I'm trying to lay out here from an ancient history perspective. And also what must be done and your ability to facilitate what must be done to get us from A to B. And that's a collective project. We have to rise. We don't want to have the same fate as we did in Atlantis. The reason why there's all these visitation stuff that's happened since we started doing all this nuclear and atomic testing is because they're afraid we're going to blow the whole goddamn place up. Why do you think they're afraid of that? Because we did it before. I don't even know how many times we've done it before. But there's enough evidence on the table to indicate that quite clearly, probably around 10,000 to 12,000 BCE, something really shitty happened and wiped out a lot of shit. Now, I want to speak to one thing, which actually was one of the things that I was pretty skeptical, and then I'll bring this to a close because I have other work that I have to do, actually. So why are there no written records from back then? Why was writing invented? It looks like writing was invented in the 3rd or the 4th millennium BCE and by ancient Sumer, and it looks like it cropped up in the Far East and then in ancient Egypt, and somewhat independently, which we see that phenomenon quite a bit, that these sort of writing systems as a technological development, and that allows us to build the storehouse of knowledge upon which civilization itself can be constructed and evolve and advance. We don't see any written records prior to that. So it looks like the explanation for that, more or less, is that they weren't really relying on written records necessarily. Doesn't mean that there wasn't writing, but they weren't necessarily relying from a civilization standpoint upon written records. Well, how do you have an advanced civilization without a sort of library of knowledge? It's impossible, right? It's impossible. I agree with that. And this is where some of the interdimensionality and the psychic capabilities and things like the Akashic Records and stuff like that starts to pull some of the pieces together. If in fact that civilization did exist, and if in fact that civilization did have advanced psychic capabilities that were lost due to the trauma involved of the destruction of that society and the abuse of those powers, that includes not just telepathy and the ability to speak to people telepathically, but also the ability, and this is the interesting part, the ability to store and retrieve that information from a metaphysical standpoint outside of physical reality. That everything that occurs in a way is stored and available and accessible in this sort of ethereal library. This is this idea of the Akashic Records. So let's just talk about how your mind works for a second, so you get a sense of what it is that I'm talking about, that it's not this terribly outlandish idea. If you forget your keys, you lose your keys, what do? Shit, where are my keys? Retrace your steps. My son loses everything. My wife is teaching him how to retrace the steps. Retrace your steps. Think, where did you leave it? And you start visually going back. Where did I go? Where did I go? Found it. That piece of information was available. You just had to retrieve it. This is the way computers work. Massively scalable computer systems with terabytes and terabytes of data. I build and manage those things. I know how they work. They're cached. There's more persistent data stores. There's all sorts of sophisticated algorithms that allow these things to get information in a split second. That's provided the infrastructure, the internet infrastructure for the world, where you can search for anything you want at the tip of your fingertips. It's a miracle, but it works. It's engineering. Events that occur in this reality, they're stored in your mind. There's a psychic impression, and you can actually block things out. If there's a traumatic event, people do that shit all the time. Okay, well, there's an individual psyche, and now we've established there's a collective psyche. It operates based on the same principles. You have a traumatic event, you're going to shut that down, you're going to move on, because you have to survive somehow. And yet we know that at the individual level, this stuff is all retrievable. We also know through past life regression hypnosis, which Dolores Cannon is sort of the expert of, and the originator of this technique, more or less, that you can go back to prior lives, which is part of the evidence that we use to know that this is more of a vehicle than it is actually you. Okay, what kind of vehicle it is different. So let's just leave this conversation understanding that there is a mental framework, a metaphysical framework for the storing and retrieval of information, of experiential information, not only at the individual level, but also at the collective level. The collective psyche is a reflection of the individual psyche. As above, so below. This is the physics of how this shit works. This is the part that's infuriating to me. It's not mysticism. Okay? This is how this stuff functions. okay? It's a massive, this is why people call it a matrix, a holographic universe, whatever. It's a massively complex and sophisticated systems infrastructure. That doesn't mean that it's not real. It just means that it operates based on certain principles. And there's a sort of illusory nature to certainly this physical reality, depending upon what your perspective is. But this data store exists at all levels, and it becomes accessible. If you want to know something, if you want to know how to play tennis, if you want to know how to sew, if you want to, you think about it, you meditate on it, you practice it. Now you have the internet, you can, and you manifest this knowledge. As Plato said, all knowledge already exists. You are discovering it and accessing it. This was in 500 BCE. Now, if you can do this for certain skills, the way Einstein figured out relativity, right? He was meditating on it, more or less. Why wouldn't the same principles be true with the collective? These records are available and they're starting to be revealed. Our true history is being revealed. And when you have that expansive knowledge of history, again, history is studied so that you don't make the same bloody mistakes. When you have that more advanced knowledge, cycle-based view of history, you can really, truly appreciate the precariousness of our times. That we have a bunch of people, of elected officials or sometimes not elected officials, that have their hand on buttons that could destroy the world in a matter of minutes. It's been like this since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Since before then, actually. And there are people, individuals, beings that are working very hard to try and make sure that that doesn't happen, because they put a lot of work into getting us to where we are, so to speak. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Dolores Cannon talks a little bit more about that, but we don't need to get into too much of that right now. So, you know, part of, and I'll sort of seed some of the other discussions that we'll have, even though I'm not going to get into them, but part of this physical form, okay, and the DNA structure provides the ability to code and encode and encrypt information, which can be released or activated at certain times based upon certain triggered events. That's the way the mind works, this whole trauma base, and you go through hypnosis and then bam, it opens up and then you have all this healing and whatever. That's the way the mind works. We know that from a psychological perspective. I'm not saying anything that's outside of the realm and domain of well understood behavioral psychology. How is it that this form is designed in such a way to behave like that? Where I'm running a query and all of a sudden I just have access to a whole new subsystem. It just came online. How the hell did that happen? But, and this is what Kant teaches us, right? If that ability exists, and again, we know that it does, what subsystems do we have access to that haven't come online yet? You need to think about that, because it's going to help you. What are you truly capable of? What's the relationship between mind and matter? What does it entail to really turn your life around? Things to consider. JV signing out. Peace. I'm going to stay. Hopefully this was helpful.